two levels, we are also applying this deep structure and the requirement of our students to be able to identify what it is in evaluation and creation. And in evaluation, we're really talking about not just being able to identify that deep structure, but also to make some judgments in terms of its subjective qualities. And so when we talk about using an evaluative framework, we're thinking about the deep structure and how the different parts of an idea or a concept or a skill are related. And I am trying to then think about what makes something good or bad. So when we think about music shows like American Idol or The Voice, the qualities that make a singing performance good are pitch, timing, musicality, enunciation, phrasing, emotive content, choreography, all that stuff. And that is something that experts understand, and they can make really good judges about it. And even sometimes I would say that people who aren't experts but have watched enough of it have developed an amount of expertise and intuitively understand these things. When we think about lessons and within a classroom, what makes a lesson good or poor? Do you have good attention getters? Do you have a good rationale? Good clarity of examples, variety of examples, differentiated assessments or elements or supports, scaffolds, challenges, integration of students' interests, all these things that make a lesson either really good or not so good. When we think about what makes writing effective, punctuation, spelling, grammar, argumentation, citations, and all this stuff, being able to evaluate that not only involves understanding that these are the parts of these complex skills, but also what makes those different parts good or bad. And so when we think of the key points about evaluation, we're also thinking about this subjective nature. And so it's not really just like, is the light switch on or off, or is the answer right or wrong? But if I'm talking about a complex, mathematical problem, was the most efficient or effective strategy used? Because again, there's a lot of different strategies to choose from. So when we think about a lot of different things in terms of our essay example or our singing example, we're thinking about whether or not things are good or bad. And a lot of time, it's a matter of taste. But there are, you have to be able to abstract back from that to think about, does it work? And if we want to teach students how to evaluate, first you need to teach them to recognize the deep structure. Secondly, you need to teach them the evaluative framework. And as you're teaching the deep structure, it's really good to talk about what makes it good, bad. What makes a thesis statement good or bad? What makes the argumentation in an essay good or bad? What about the use of counterexamples? What makes them good or bad? What about the placement of citations or graphs or anything like that? So we go through each part of that. And then we practice with different surface structures. And again, this is where it takes a lot of time to build this, because you have a complex thing that you're talking about and you're having to show them a whole bunch of different versions and they have to pull it apart. Now, if I'm teaching it and then I want to assess it, I need to give them a new surface structure of a deep structure they've seen before, but I can't tell them what deep structure it is. And then they have to use the evaluative framework to make judgments about the different elements. When we get to synthesis or creation, well, now we're really talking about being able to recognize how different deep structures can be connected. Either they're the same deep structures and different surface structures, and I'm going to combine them, or I can have two different deep structures and I want to combine those in some meaningful way. And so some examples of synthesis can include creating new recipes, music mashups, poetry mashups or slams, projecting or outcomes of current events, predicting the outcomes of scientific or natural interactions of events that have not happened, or they've happened but we haven't talked about them yet. And so students are having to combine different knowledge of what they have into something new. And a few things about this is that, it needs to work, and it needs to work in an effective and meaningful way. So again, anybody can. When I was a kid, I remember I was making my parents a meal, thought it would be nice, tried to make it fancy, took a bunch of stuff out of the fridge, didn't know what I was doing, overcook things, put seasonings that didn't go together, too much butter, it was just a mess. And you could say that I was creating my own recipe, but it wasn't effective. So it needs to be effective. It needs to actually work. And if we want to teach our students how to do this, we need to teach them different deep structures. We need to teach them strategies for figuring out how to connect these deep structures, where those touch points are. And then we need some practice combining different concepts and deep structures together to try to make something new. And then actually using an evaluative framework that we taught through the evaluation part about what makes it successful or not. When we think about, some concrete examples, say you're teaching a science class and you are trying to determine what the impact of an invasive species will have. Well, I need to know the deep structure of this invasive species, what its habitat, predators, enemies, whatever resources are. And then I also need to know the deep structure of the ecosystem. And these two things haven't been together. And I want to know what's going to happen. And I should think about things about the life cycle of the species, its needs, the affordances of that ecosystem, its likelihood for survival, its competitors. And so I'm using kind of these evaluative frameworks and these deep structures to try to combine them and figure out how these things are going to get together. I might also think about, we need a new constitution, maybe about technology and artificial intelligence. And one of the points people make about these things these days is that, we don't know what kind of regulations we're going to need because these capabilities have never existed before. And it might really be threatening the underpinnings of our whole society. And so given a new technology and trying to think through what are its capabilities, how does it overlap with existing laws like freedom of speech and access or opportunity or equity, and trying to figure out how those things fit and whether or not there needs to be any kind of regulation. So that about wraps it up for the different levels of cognition. Ultimately, what I want you to be able to do is use these guides and these descriptions to try to identify what your goals are at and really make sense of what you're shooting for and how you should teach, as well as how you should assess. One of the tasks that I have to practice is there's a quiz with a whole bunch of different levels of cognition. There's one to practice and then there's one for keeps. And I want you to take both of those things. So take a look at them, look through the responses, and I'll post some video feedback, and then you can determine whether or not you have any questions. And if you do, you can post those on the discussion board. I'll be looking at those each morning, probably by 11 or noon, and you can use that going forward to make any changes that you might need. Okay, good luck.